Assalamualaikum class. My name is Aman Hashmi and I'm from 4th Prof. Today this is my presentation about the exploratory behavior in the animals. The objectives that we are going to cover in this slide or in this presentation are the definition of exploration, its aim, and different apparatus and their comparisons, and one of the important experimental analysis that we are going to study and compare if it is a valid measure or not. Then we will compare it with the elevated maze with justification. Elevated maze with justification. Moving towards the introduction, exploration. Exploration is basically very important, very important behavior of the animal, or we can say the default or built-in behavior of the animals. Whenever the animals are placed in a new environment, they receive a novel stimulus. Novel stimulus, I can explain you the novel stimulus in a very precise manner. Novel stimulus is an unconditioned, unfamiliar stimulus, whereas there are some of the familiar stimulus. Familiar stimulus are those that an animal is habitual of, and novel stimulus are the new stimulus. So when there are some novel stimulus, or when animals are placed in a new environment or a new they explore different food sources present in the new environment, shelters or mating opportunities. They may show predation, aggression, even the sometimes in the new environment when they are placed. Here, two terms are associated with this exploration experiment. One is the neophilia, another one is the neophobia. Neophilia is basically, as we already know, that philia means the loving nature and phobia means the fearing. Here we are saying okay, neophobia is the aversion. Aversion means hatred or fear that an animal shows towards approaching an oval object or place. Neophilia में क्या है आपके पास कि it is the attraction that an animal displays when animals are placed in an environment, in a totally new environment. They show some of the attraction. They want to explore that environment. They want to explore every corner of that environment. That is your neophilia. And when they sit back at the side of the corner, this is neophobia. Then we have aim of studying exploratory behavior. Why we are studying exploratory behavior? This has got a great importance in the pharmacology. Why? For example, researchers studies a number of antidepressants and anxiolytics, and they want to know the neural mechanisms besides lying under the neophilia and neophobia mechanisms, neophilia or neo mechanisms. So they want to do research over that. For that, these things, these behavioral mechanisms are important. One of the most important used, most commonly and importantly used apparatus that was the most common in the past was open field apparatus. ठीक है? In this open field apparatus, it was basically a flat and slightly raised platform, and nowadays the open field is any apparatus that has an enclosed arena. Open field was previously used to check out the exploratory behavior of the animal, and what was the interpretation of the result, how we used to interpret the result. The overall level of locomotion and time spent in the center of the arena was considered as as a measure of exploratory behavior in the open field in past historical. But there were some arguments made by the researchers. One of the most important argument was that okay, this is something that you are forcing an animal to stay in an enclosed arena, and it is not impacting its original behavior, exploratory behavior. Rather, it's a you are suppressing the animal. So these were the arguments that were made by the researchers, and results showed that corticosterol levels increased when they were placed in an open field environment with a novel stimulus, and open field behavior was also field behavior is influenced by some of the anxiolytic, anxiety reducing drugs. Then conclusion was that there were a number of researchers that were not in the favor of open field experiment to be used as an exploratory behavior or to be used as a neophilia. So they did a very limited research on the neophilia by using the open field. So these were the drawbacks of open. Okay, so the arguments and drawbacks led to the beginning of whole board apparatus. In the 1970s, researchers began to use the whole board apparatus, which consists of an enclosed arena with holes. There were holes present on the floor, and the measure that we used to interpret the results, or through which we were able to differentiate, we were able to find out the exploratory behavior, was the frequency and duration of head dipping are assumed to provide measures of neophilia. Head dipping. What is head dipping? Let me show head dipping. There are some holes present at the floor, and the mouse, whatever the rodent or animal can poke its head uh, in and out in and out of those holes. This is what we call as head dipping. So the frequency and the duration of head dipping are assumed to provide measures of neophilia. This is known as directed exploration. We can call neophilia directed exploration and neophobia an undirected exploration or negative exploration. This apparatus has been argued as well because there was a question that how a person would be able to differentiate between the general motor activity and the head dipping. Then there were some mathematical formulations and physical phenomena that they used to describe the difference between the general locomotion and the head dipping. Then in general, high levels of you can interpret your result through this, that high levels of head dipping are interpreted as indicative of neophilia. It means neophilia is present, while low levels are assumed neophilia is present. It means exploratory behavior is present. While low levels are assumed to result from a lack of neophilia or are assumed to reflect the high anxiety-like state in the animal, the Holbrook task is currently being used as a test of neophilia in many areas of behavior pharmacology. Now, it is again the history. In this, they have explained that researchers attempted a number of experiments to describe the difference, describe the effect of different classes of drugs on the head tipping, or basically on the exploratory behavior of the rodents. If head tipping is a neophilic response that is suppressed by an anxiety-like response, treatment with anxiolytic agents is predicted to increase head tipping. A recent review has suggested that the effects of anxiolytic compounds on head tipping behavior are generally confounded by changes in overall locomotion, despite the claims that head tipping is unrelated to locomotor activity. Similarly, a study of several infrared mouse strains reported that head dipping and locomotion are highly correlated. Neither head dipping can be interpreted as a valid measure of neophilia remains unresolved. Now the experimental analysis. The aim of the study we already knew was that this whole board apparatus was actually a valid measure to measure of neophilia or not. So here we are taking two factors. One is the over repeated sessions, and the second factor is when objects are placed underneath the holes. Repeated exposure to a novel apparatus is expected to produce a reduction in exploration as the animal becomes familiar with the environment, a process commonly referred to as habituation. What they are saying, that when animals becomes habitual of the environment, the stimulus is no more a unconditioned or non-familiar stimulus. It becomes a familiar stimulus, and when it becomes a familiar stimulus, on the number of attempts, the head dipping decreases. Here it is already mentioned. In early study, head dipping by young mice 21 to 25 postnatal days was reported to be lower on a second exposure because it became habitual of that stimulus, right? Then we have materials and methods. In the materials and methods, subjects in housing. We actually took eight animals, eight males and eight females, and we placed them in a single room. And the room had small holes at the floor, holes at the floor, and beneath there were the one apparatus had some of the objects beneath that floor, and one had nothing. No objects were present. The animals were housed in a single room which was controlled for temperature. It had a controlled temperature, controlled humidity, and there was 12 hours light and dark cycle. The animals were housed in the same gender pairs in plastic and wire mesh home cages, and the size of the home cages is given with ad libitum. Ad libitum means once for the pleasure. Once for the pleasure, access to rodent pellets and water. For their pleasure or for their needs, they were provided with the means of water and food. And here we are following USA and UK guidelines and requirements to do any experiment on the laboratory animal care. Then here's the apparatus. It is all about the apparatus. The whole board apparatus was a wooden grey box, 68 by 68 centimeters. Walls were 40 centimeters high, and the box was 28 centimeter above the ground on a metal stand. There were four holes with a 4 centimeter in diameter, and each hole was 28 centimeter from a corner of the box along the diagonal from the corner to the center. Right, the floor of the box was marked out in four outer areas, and the central area was delineated by four lines of tape, each 20 centimeter from one of the walls, while the four outer areas were marked out by diagonal lines of tape running from the corners of the floor to the corners of the central square. The four holes were thus located at the corners of the central square. The apparatus was located in a small testing room with dimmed white lighting. The stand of the apparatus was uh, open on all sides, allowing the floor or objects to be dimly lit. Then procedure. Procedure is very simple. Each subject, each trial, we gave each trial 10 minutes, and each subject was tested for 10 times. So 10 minutes and 10 times in the whole board, once per day, and we alternately exchanged the male and female pairs. During the first set of 5 trials, no objects were present underneath the holes of the apparatus, right? And during the second set of 5 trials, objects were placed underneath under the four holes, right? 20, the objects were all distinct from each other but were similar in size, approximately 10 centimeter in length or diameter. Then we have behavioral measurements. How we are going to interpret the results? We can see three things. One is if the animal is moving here and there, entering in a new area, and moves from one area of the open field to another, all four paws had to be placed on the floor of a new area. This is entering a new area. Then there is head tipping that I already explained in the second slide. The animal places its head into one of the holes to a minimum depth such that the ears were level with the floor of the apparatus. This is head tipping. Then rear. Rear is some kind of dead body position of the animal. The animal is stationary on its back paws and raises its forepaws off the ground, extending its body vertically. Here are the observations that were calculated through the software, but we can also calculate using manually using a calculator. Here, without object trials, 1 to 5 object trials were without objects, 6 to 10 were with objects, and there is then mean. मीन लिया है हमने 1 to 10 का. We have to check out the variation in the data. You can see here is plus minus 3.3 plus minus 2.2 males and females, plus minus 1.2 plus minus 0.9 means का हम देख रहे हैं with objects and without objects का, and there is variation in the data. Now results. What results are showing? Results are showing that head dipping was high during the first test, decreased over the following 2 trials, and remained relatively stable. ठीक है, ये हमें result मिला है. Now we will interpret that result or discuss it. The initial drop in head dipping following the first trial could be interpreted in two ways. First, head dipping could be indicative of a neophilic response that decreases as the animal becomes familiar with the apparatus. That is, head dipping represents directed exploratory behavior that drops as the apparatus loses its novelty, right? They are just simply saying that when animal becomes familiar with the background, head dipping decreases. If this interpretation is correct, we would also predict that head dipping would be a greater in the presence of objects, क्योंकि उसको novelty मौजूद थी उस वक्त in the presence of objects. However, there was no evidence of an increase in head dipping behavior when objects were present underneath the holes. These results do not support the hypothesis that head dipping is a valid measure of neophilia. Now we are comparing the results with that of the elevated maze. Our results show that repeated exposure of subjects to a novel whole world apparatus greatly affects the behavioral response, and that the neophobic response experienced by subjects during the first exposure to an apparatus apparently declines over further exposures. Repeated exposure to another commonly used behavioral test, the elevated maze, has been reported to result in an increase in total locomotion and a decrease in the amount of time spent on average open sections of the maze. In contrast, in our study, no change of overall locomotion was found on repeated exposure to the whole board, and the amount of time spent in the various central area of the whole board apparatus increased over sessions. Then they are again saying what were the things that caused these differences in the elevated maze and whole board? The difference in the design of the two types of apparatus. Number one point: repeated exposure to an elevated maze, which consists of open areas and closed areas, may have resulted in the subjects retreating into the darker, closed arms once an initial investigation had found no potential escape routes from the apparatus. Such as a response was not an option in the whole board test. If a shelter were added to the whole board apparatus, locomotion might be predicted to decrease over repeated exposure, with subjects choosing to remain under a shelter once potential escape routes had been investigated. Now, here we are dealing with these particular uh, two types of mechanisms or behaviors. This is head tipping and this is rare. These are the normal social behaviors observed in rodents, especially when experimental analysis is carried out. In whole board apparatus method, the most important one is head tips. Basically, as we know previously, that there are different holes, and the rodent puts his head in and out many times in order to explore the new home or apparatus. This is what we call exploratory behavior of animal. This can be affected by using certain drugs. As we told about the rear position, it is a vertical position. Now moving towards the next slide. Disruption of exploratory. It is the most important topic of the whole experiment. Here we are disrupting or distracting the whole of the mechanism by giving some of the antidepressants, some of the anxiolytics. Here we are giving haloperidol. We are giving haloperidol 4 mg per kg, chlorpromazine 8 mg per kg, and thioridazine 16 mg per kg. This adversely affected exploration at doses which almost immobilized the mice. Then we are given amphetamine 8 mg per kg. Disrupted exploratory behavior in the mice, although the mice were observed to move around the board very quickly. With tranile cyproamine 2 mg and nialamide 100 mg increased exploratory behavior by comparison with controls was recorded in the mice when they were tested 24 hours after drug treatment. Imipramine 20 mg per kg reduced the total number of tunnels entered by the mice on the first day, but on the second day, the mice behaved in a similar way to mice treated with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which are a class of antidepressants. Now we have the images of different apparatus that we use: condition, place, preference, object recognition, light dark box, open field, and whole board. Whole board, here are the holes present at the floor, and the mouse or the rodent is placed inside this